Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Christina Jones Davis. Welcome, Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to come back. We did this earlier and we had some technical difficulties, but I thank you for being gracious enough to lend your time to do this again, because I believe it's very important. For those who don't know who you are, can you give just a little bit of background?
Sure. So as you mentioned, my name is Christina Jones Davis, and I'm currently serving as the clinic director and as faculty of pastoral care and counseling at CTS, Christian Theological Seminary here in Indianapolis, Indiana. I've come to this work by way of first a call to ministry. And when I went to seminary, I knew that I wanted to preach the gospel, but I also knew that I wanted to help who really had some life difficulties that may need more one-on-one attention, more in-depth work. And so I coupled that with being trained as a mental health, a licensed marriage and family therapist is my licensure. So I got my training in both, and to this day I enjoy combining them, working with both spirituality, mental health. I see that they go together very well, and I enjoy integrating that in my work with people.
That's awesome. And I think what you do is very important and vital to our community, especially along with all other communities, but my deep passion for our own community and you taking the time to invest back into us, I think is amazing. Why is sometimes talking about mental health or mental illness so taboo in our community specifically, but just our nation in general?
Yeah, I think what happens in African American communities is that we have come by our difficulty in talking about this very honestly. When we think about mental health, I think we also have to, at the same time, think about healthcare in general. And healthcare in general has come with its long legacy of really some poor treatment, mistreatment of African Americans. We know about the Tuskegee cases. We know about the sterilization of African American women without consent. There are warranted reasons for which there can be some leeriness about both mental illness and mental health care. And so I think we've got to and address people's need for building that trust and having trusted providers established. So the other thing is this sense of resilience that's really wonderful in African American communities. We, I think, have had to be very tough-minded, be very resourceful. We've had to kind of overcome a lot without a lot of support from mental health providers. And so now that we get help, I think it's sometimes learning that we don't have to carry all these things by ourselves. When we have our emotional distress or burdens, we don't have to always do it ourselves. There are people out there to help us. And in fact, vulnerability is its own form of strength, right? We don't often think about vulnerability as something that makes us strong, but in fact, I have learned it is harder oftentimes to ask for help than it is to try to grit and bear it on one's own.
Mm-hmm. And that's helpful. I think I'm a quote you on Twitter for that one. Vulnerability is its own form of strength, because I think that is so true. And so many times we're trying to just get through because we think, you just have to get through it. But to be vulnerable is to be strong in a sense. I think that just that statement alone can be freeing for so many people. How do you think the Black church specifically, or Black churches or the Black community has talked about mental illness in a way that has been damaging to people? And maybe we should, I thought about this after we did the last one, maybe we should define mental illness for those who are listening.
That's great. Yeah, let's talk about that first, about how are we understanding mental illness. And I do think connects with your first question about the taboo. And sometimes we just don't understand, right? We formulate assumptions about what mental illness is and isn't and what it means. So mental illness is oftentimes when you've got something that can be categorized diagnostically. We have a diagnostic manual that a list of behaviors, a list of I won't even say characteristics all the time. Sometimes it is, but a list of symptoms. And if you meet these criteria, then we have a name for what it is that is troubling you, what it is that's hurting, what it is that's painful, and that sometimes helps give us some orientation about then how to address it. So take, for example, if somebody has a heart condition or diabetes or whatever, they go to the doctor, right? A physical doctor will assess the symptoms, they'll give it a name, and they'll say, hey, we've seen something like this before, we've studied this, we've got some proven results. Here is a treatment plan for you. It might include medication, it might not, it might include lifestyle change, it might not, but there are ways that we can then move forward and address it. And so to me, that's what we're talking about. Our brain, our mind is an organ, and we've got to take care of it. And mental health, mental illness is what how we understand how to take care of our minds. I think another thing to mention is that you don't have a mental illness. You could still just be going through a tough time in life, right? A time in which mental health care or having a therapist or a counselor is really, really useful. And so you don't have to even have a diagnosis to be able to say, you know, I'm grieving a loss right now, and I need some support with that. And there's no shame in that, right? Likewise, sometimes mental health is really fluid. We know that 1 in 5 people will experience a mental illness this year. And that doesn't mean that that one person, though, will have that same mental illness next year, right? It means that there are times where we encounter things. I can share my own story. When I had my first child, I was diagnosed with a postpartum mood disorder. And so I knew already something was not right, but this gave a name for it. And this said, hey, there are resources out there that I could take advantage of, that I could be supported in, and those were things that were in many ways, but could have been a lot worse, right? Had somebody not taken the time to tell me what was going on and to get the support that was needed. And so we're talking about that spectrum of things when we talk about mental health and mental illness. To your second question, right? So how does the church participate in talking about mental illness in ways that are helpful, not helpful? Yeah, I think this is common to African American churches as well as other faith communities. There are sometimes harmful, I think, interpretations of mental illness as a result of something you've done wrong, some sin, some lifestyle. You know, this is God punishing you, and I think that's very cool way of understanding it. In part because there are some hereditary, there's a biochemistry that's involved with a lot of mental illness that have nothing to do, right, with whether or not somebody did something wrong. It has to do with genetics. There's also environmental factors, right? I think for the African American community especially, we've got to understand that you can have the same biology, but sometimes mental illness is not kind of it's not activated unless there's a certain set of stressors environmentally. We know that economic stressors, we know that violence and being exposed to violence is a stressor. We know that all of these things impact African Americans disproportionately. And so to blame the individual, harmful theology. And I think what we need to do is to come around them and make sure that they understand their options of how to get help. They understand, you know, we as African Americans, we tend to have less prevalence of most mental health when we do have them. They're more chronic and more severe. And that is attributed in large part with because we're not accessing help in as large numbers as other populations. And so I think churches can play a huge role in connecting people to help rather than saying, this is something that you're doing wrong.
Mm-hmm. And when I think about those external stressors, I think about just the traumas that we're experiencing now, especially seeing violence and Black and brown men getting gunned down by the police, are triggers, and trigger a certain hopelessness in the minds of people. I know this wasn't a question I previously sent to you, but I just thought about it. Have you seen that trauma affect people and kind of change people, just seeing how we're overly exposed sometimes with video and can actually see? I think about the murder of Philando Castile, like we can actually see him dying. How does that affect us?
Absolutely, absolutely. There is, I think, more and more research being done about PTSD, not just as a chronic one-time event that you have to be directly exposed to, but we're looking at it more so now that it can be a chronic accumulation of feeling unsafe and a secondary reaction to exposure to, right, whether you're first responders, whether you're ministers, whether you're therapists, but or whether you're family and friends in a neighborhood or watching on media, that signal to you that the world is not safe, that I am being targeted. And absolutely, as persons of color, this type of PTS-like, and in some cases PTSD, can really occur through that secondary accumulation of trauma. And so absolutely, we've got to take that seriously. And it's not to say that it's the individual, that they have something that's kind of characterological or something weak or something that they're not doing. It's just that recognize that it is a miracle that we have made it this far and that we have been this resilient as a people. And at the same time, we've encountered and we've undergone quite kind of existence and past that that it's okay to say you can get support with that, and you can talk about that. You need safe spaces to be able to do that. And I've had some amazingly salvific and cathartic and sanctuary-like spaces made by therapists who will say, you don't have to consciousness here. You can just be and let out all of that fear, that anger, and I can hold that for you as we work through this together. And so yeah, I think that's one source of stress that we as African Americans really do need to be proactive and can be proactive about getting help with.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you talked about how like counseling creates a safe space for conversation, because I remember in college having a traumatic experience and not till grad school going to counseling about that and kind of unwinding all of those things and talking through it with somebody that I didn't know, and a licensed counselor really created a healing place. And then it wasn't until like me thinking through like rereading James and him talking about confessing your faults one to another that you may be healed. And I was like, it's interesting that, we pray to God for forgiveness, and forgiveness of sins, but you can be forgiven and not healed. And so that confession piece comes through confessing to other people, not just praying to God. So
Preach.
I think,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Confessional. I love that.
what ways can the church facilitate or better equip or help people who are struggling with mental illness, but just difficult times? Because it's not like, like we were talking about, it's not just, this person is going through a specific illness, but they might just be going through a rough time. What are healthy things that the church could do to help facilitate healing?
Sure. Yeah, I think that, and we mentioned this a little bit about prayer. And, I think prayer is prayer still works, right? Prayer is still powerful. And I do think that that is one resource. In fact, research tells us that persons who have a strong kind of prayer life, people, there is research studies with couples work, that people who integrated prayer into their work with African-American couples had better outcomes in therapy than those who did not. And so we know that, you know, in case we needed a study to prove it, that prayer has an impact. It's just to also say that's not all there is that God has given us in our toolbox in terms of what can provide health and healing for folks. I think that ministers, pastors can really also benefit from partners in the community that kind of feel as though they have to be all things to all people. I think that to partner with folks in the community, you want to have at least 3 professionals that I used to say are in your Rolodex. That's really dated, but basically that you have contacts for, speed dial for, somewhere in your phone. The first is a trusted psychiatrist. And so a psychiatrist is a professional who prescribes medication, who has the ability to prescribe medication. Trusted one, right? There are some psychiatrists who may not take as much time with individuals as they need to fully assess, to fully get an understanding before they do that prescribing. And I would say you want to ask about that. You know, how long do you have your intake sessions for? How long do you see people? If it's 10 minutes, if it's 15 minutes, that's probably not the psychiatrist you're going to go with. But if it's anywhere between 30, even better, an hour that they use to kind of initially assess people, I would say you want to start talking to that person. Okay, well then, you know, how do you account for cultural differences? How do you account for spirituality? If you are with somebody who you can tell that they're going to respect that from the people that you refer to them, then that's going to be a good partner in the community. And when you refer people to them, you'll feel good about that, and your parishioner will pick up on the fact that you trust this. You can say, I know this person, and go with them to the first appointment even, right? So you can wait in the lobby, but the most difficult part comes, and I think I mentioned that even though we have less prevalence overall of mental illness, we seek out less help, and just that handoff to transfer the trust that they have in you as their minister, who they see every Sunday and they know and they love, transfer that trust to that provider by saying, let me go with you. Let me make sure you get there okay. Let me make sure you find the place okay. You know, take off that added burden and help them get connected. And the same is true for trusted therapist. And I would say there are 2 types of therapists, one that specializes in family and couples work, and then one that may specialize in individual work. And you can tell that oftentimes by their licensure. So a licensed marriage and family therapist will have specific training in working with couples and families. And then someone who is a licensed professional counselor, for instance, will have specialty working with individuals. So that category. The last one I'll just mention is a psychologist. And if you can find a trusted provider to refer to, they can do testing for you, whether that be for things like personality tests, cognitive tests, if there's any cognitive disabilities. They can do testing to give people information about what's going on that can be very useful as well. So I think all of these things in terms of partnerships, I think in terms of providing spiritual resources such as prayer is so important. We are not discounting the power of spiritual commitment and disciplines and connection, but I think it's a both and I think pastors would do well to make sure they're doing both.
Mm-hmm. Do you think pastors specifically should maybe take some training for counseling since they see so many people?
Absolutely. I think some some basic training is really, really key. I know that lots of folks, if they have an MDiv, they've taken Introduction to Pastoral Care. That I would highly recommend. If you don't get the full MDiv, just take that class, you know, for credit, audit it, what have you. Take that class. That will give a good introduction to some of these things. The other is a national program. It's called mental health first aid. And you can Google, or you can actually type in mentalhealthfirstaid.org, and you can find a training near you. This is a wonderful introductory training that lets pastors, ministers, laypersons of all sorts who work in various healthcare fields know the signs, right? What are the signs we should be looking for where something's not quite right, where somebody needs some additional help than what I can provide? And then, of course, it will let you know what you can do to initially address that crisis if you're the first person, or to, again, get them referred to somebody who can help them.
Mm-hmm. I think that's awesome to have that resource and be able to, like you said, relieve yourself of the pressure of trying to be all things to all men, and because that could really weigh a leader down and shorten their lifespan.
Absolutely, absolutely. The mental health of the minister matters too, right? As ministers, we are people too. We've got to take care of ourselves, and that is a huge issue. Clergy burnout, clergy mental health. It's all impacted by the way we also set our limits and use our partners. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know a lot of clergy are now actively getting having a scheduled routine with a counselor to kind of unwind all the stuff that they take in.
Yeah, it's so important. Yeah,
Mhm.
very good.
Is that something you encourage your students to do as well once if they're lead pastors or senior pastors?
I do. I am a living testimony. I tell as many people as I can that I have had wonderful counseling experiences over the course of my life, and so I readily make that to our ministers, but also we have counseling degrees here at CTS, and our counselors are actually required to have their own personal therapy. How about that? It is a requirement. And so because we recognize that in a lot of the healing and health ministries, we have to take ownership of our own stuff first in order to not put that baggage onto somebody else. We've got to be aware of what's going on with us so that we can differentiate and be healthy. And so that's worked really well with our therapists here. They may have a little resistance at first, but exception at the end, they're always citing that as one of the things that was most beneficial to them throughout their program.
Mm-hmm. What are the resources that you would recommend, books for clergy, and then those for just parishioners as well?
Yeah, so I think one book that I think is helpful for clergy and parishioners it's really a series, but it's called the WRAP program, and it's an acronym that stands for Wellness Recovery Action Plan. I have a little example here, but this is one that it's for families. It can also be used in congregational settings. The author is Mary Ellen Copeland, and she has a whole series. You can Google WRAP, WRAP, and you will get several workbooks, workshop options, and things like that. So what this does is it provides people with a way of organizing support, and that could be community support through the church, their family support, what to look for if they're dealing with a mental illness. They can participate, have a sense of agency of letting their community know what to look for if I need help, what to do if you see this, if how they can have their own ownership of what they need to do on a daily basis to remain well. And so I found that to be really helpful for folks. The other thing is that I would just equip your viewers with a few really reputable hotlines. And so if folks are wondering kind of who to call if they're encountering crisis, there's a suicide prevention hotline. It's a national line, and that number is 1-800-73 8255. And this is a great line if you, again, are a first responder with somebody who's thinking about hurting themselves, or if you yourself are having those thoughts. This is a wonderful resource. The other is the National Alliance of Mental Illness. It's called NAMI, an acronym. These groups are really wonderful for setting up within churches. A lot of times they community already, but sometimes you can host these meetings, and it's a peer support group that is really helpful. there's a hotline to kind of help you identify one of those sites, or to be able to kind of establish that at your church. And that number is 1-800-273-8255. And the third one that I'll mention is a treatment referral helpline. And this helpline is, again, it's a national SAMHSA sponsored helpline, and that's 1-877-64727. So if you're looking for a place to start with identifying who are your local providers that you can partner with in order to provide services, this is a great place to start to identify those.
Would that line also help? Because I know one of the major obstacles one of the different people I talk to about this issue is them not being able to afford it. Would those lines also help partner them with people who may offer free services, or see if their insurance will accept it?
Yes, that is a very common barrier, unfortunately, for mental health services, is affordability and access. And I think that the referral hotline will and should have a variety of resources in your area. A lot of times there are people who provide sliding scale fee based on income. That's what I've seen is that with private practices, you have the ability to have your own say about what you charge. Now, given that, if you've got insurance, and this is something that I think is just a practical piece for pastors and for individuals, is that you can start with calling your insurance and asking who's in network, because I do think it's frustrating when you kind of identify a provider, but they're not in network, they don't take your insurance and all this. So I do think starting with who's in network will give you the best rate for your insurance. Then you reminded me, but Psychology Today is also a national database online. If you Google Psychology Today, and it's Find a Therapist portal, helps you to both review also their rates, their session rates. We're really blessed here at the Counseling Center, Christian Theological Seminary. We can provide very affordable rates because we're a training center. And so that's in Indianapolis. If there are similar educational institutions at our training centers, there may be some similar resources and help with affordability there.
Yeah, and I was shocked that at my school, in grad school, they offered a licensed therapist for free for, I think it was like 6 sessions, which was how I was able to take advantage of that as a struggling, poor seminary student. But you know, you might be surprised that your school will offer it too.
That is a great resource. That's a great suggestion to check out if you're a student, what your student benefits, so to speak, already provide for you.
What would you like to share with our audience that we may haven't had the opportunity to discuss yet, or would you like to leave with us?
Sure. Well, I think that there is this there's this piece about when it comes to mental illness and who suffers from it, I just want to bring it home a little bit. I just want to say, I know that I said it earlier, that 1 in 5 people suffer with mental illness each year. So that's a lot of us, and it means that in our churches, on any given pew, is someone who is suffering, and we really just don't want them to suffer in silence. I think that's where I think churches can have a really powerful role. That if you're a preacher, if you're a pastor, if you're a minister, you're having this platform right now, Lisa, which is wonderful, to say it's okay, right? There is help. It's good news, right? We need to be preaching and proclaiming there is help. You don't have to suffer alone. And I think that from the pulpit, these are powerful messages to say to parishioners that that help them know that they don't have to just suffer in silence. And the last thing I'll say is that if it's not you on that year, could be you on another year. And so we've got to take care of ourselves, right? We've got to be able to say, and especially as leaders, that we start with ourselves too, that we set an example for caring for our mental health, our overall health for our parishioners as well. So we kind of got to walk the walk as well.
That's awesome. How will people get in contact with you if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing? What would be the best way to get in contact with you?
The best way is by email, and that email address is cdavis@cts.edu.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Davis. This has been a great time. I think this actually was our conversation. This time was actually better than the last
Oh,
time.
good. That worked
Probably
out.
because I could hear you a little bit better this time.
Good, good,
But thank you
good.
for being willing to do it again. Technology kind of has creates obstacles, so thank you so much.
Sure, sure. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.